Welcome to the Independent Schools podcast with me, Juliet Corbett. I'm absolutely passionate about adapting best practice and research from the business sector to address the real-world challenges being faced by schools. In this podcast, leaders of independent schools will learn actionable tips and strategies to strengthen their school's income streams, be it through fees, fundraising, or commercial ventures. So thanks for joining me today, and let's jump straight in. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode. So over the last couple of weeks and months, so many people have asked me my predictions on to what extent we're going to see fundraising income fall amongst schools. Now, it's been virtually impossible to give people a concrete prediction for that, as the situation that we're in is revealing itself as we live through it. But there is data out there that we can use to inform our thinking around this, specifically from the 2008-10 recession that followed the global financial crisis and the way that philanthropic donations responded to that crisis. And secondly, I think it's really important that we recognise that even if we don't know to what extent there will be a fall in income, what are the steps that we can take as independent schools to try to protect that income stream, to try and minimise that fall as much as possible. And as much as we can look at averages across the sector, the actions that individual school leaders take at this point will influence to what extent their own philanthropic income is affected by this crisis. So first of all, I'm going to review some of the data for you with regards to philanthropic donations during and after the 2008 financial crisis. So Giving USA produces an annual report on philanthropic giving levels within the US. And the 2008 recession saw a 7% drop in giving. So that is a fall. It's not necessarily the catastrophic fall that some people were predicting at that time. And in fact, it was a lot less than we saw the stock markets fall through that period. And then after the 2008 recession and the economy started to come out of that recession, we saw a continued growth in philanthropic donations. And actually within the US, the philanthropic giving levels had reached the pre-recession highs again by about 2014 or thereabouts. So there was a recovery that didn't take as long as some people predicted at the time. Within the UK, the Charities Aid Foundation, known as CAF, and the National Council for Voluntary Organisations produced a report in 2009 about the impact of the recession on charitable giving in the UK. So they found that there was a drop of 11% in philanthropic giving in 2008-9 compared to the previous year. And interestingly, we saw during that crisis that there was very little shift in the types of charities that people were supporting with their donations. So education maintained a very similar percentage of the total overall philanthropic giving. But interestingly, actually those falls of 11% in the UK were much less than was being predicted by the media at the time of the crisis. And this has actually been shown in some research, which I will link to from the episode notes. So if you want to look at any of those reports that I've referenced, you can go to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/003 to see the notes for this podcast episode. So what we're seeing is that yes, a recession does lead to a fall in donations, but with a fall of 7% in the US and 11% in the UK, actually these aren't catastrophic falls, and that then following the recession, as the economy starts to settle down and people start to feel more confident about their own wealth and income, we start to see philanthropic giving pick up again. So it's not as catastrophic as some people predict at the time. Oh, it's interesting to think about why that might be. So a lot of people assume that philanthropic giving is based either mostly or entirely on people's individual income or wealth. But in actual fact, the research into philanthropic giving doesn't actually tell us that. It actually says that although someone's income or wealth is an important factor in them deciding what kind of gift to make and to whom, what's much more important is the non-economic factors. And there's some very interesting research, a book published in 2004 called Why Rich People Give by Teresa Lloyd here in the UK, And she identifies 5 major motivations for giving. Things like belief in the cause, believing that your gift can be a catalyst for change, so something can happen which wasn't going to be possible before. A sense of self-actualization, as she puts it. So this is to do with someone feeling that they can grow their own identity, if you like, by making that gift. A sense of duty or responsibility, so the idea that you pay back to organisations that have helped you, or that it's your duty as one of the more wealthy members of a society to support others. And also the ability for donors to form strong relationships with both the individuals who run the organisations that they give to, and also with the recipients who are actually benefiting from their philanthropy. So interestingly, the research definitely shows that just because somebody has money does not mean they're going to give, and that much more important than that is a sense that someone has a personal connection, a belief in the cause that they're giving to. And of course, this isn't a big surprise. So us fundraisers who have been around for a while, we know that we need to go out there with a case for support, so a reason for someone to give, where they actually feel a connection to the cause. It's not just about the numbers, although that's important. It's about demonstrating the difference that somebody can make and the impact that their donation can have. But as you might expect, the research has also shown that having more money is one of the major factors which means that people will consider increasing their giving levels. And it's not a leap of faith to then believe that having less money in your pocket this year than last year might be one of those factors that causes people to reduce their amount of giving. And that's why we do see a fall in philanthropic giving during recessions. So far we've looked at data and research from the USA and the UK, but I think there's evidence that many of these trends will be common across other countries. So for example, within Australia, JB Ware estimates that total giving will decrease by around 7.1% in 2020, and then that we'll see a further 11.9% fall in 2021. So that would take giving levels back to the same level seen as in 2012. So again, although these figures are large, they are falls in income that we can expect for schools. We're not talking about giving levels plummeting to zero. We can see that there is going to be continued interest in giving, and that if our case for support around what our schools can do to help communities bounce back from COVID-19, I think that we can be optimistic that schools fundraising can and will bounce back if we take the right steps. So what sort of recommendations come out from this work? So in the CAF report here in the UK, the recommendation was very firmly, and in fact I'm quoting from that report, charities should continue to ask for support during an economic downturn. There's this sense that actually there will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we stop asking because we assume people don't want to give, then we will inevitably see a fall in philanthropic income. But that's because we've stopped asking. If we continue to ask in a empathetic, authentic, and impactful way, so that people feel that personal connection through to our schools still, it's not necessarily a given that our income is going to fall substantially and permanently. Although, yes, I think it is a realistic assumption that we will probably see a fall in fundraising income for schools in the short to medium term. So what's really important here is that we continue to develop those relationships with our potential donors. We want to link our cause back through to those motivations for giving. Things like that belief in the cause, the sense that people are being a catalyst for change. Their donations are really having an impact. So I think at this point, what's really useful and the next step in this discussion is not just looking back at the data from 2008, but it's looking forward. What are the steps that we can take as schools to minimise the impact on our fundraising income going forwards? Now, I want to dwell today a little bit on the role of relationships and building and maintaining relationships with potential donors. Now, some of you who are listening who are experienced fundraisers may find that this next section of the episode is pretty much obvious. But what I've learned is that actually what can be really obvious to us as experienced fundraisers isn't always obvious to everyone else around us. So those people who haven't necessarily done a lot of fundraising, but who now in senior leadership roles within schools often need a bit of background. They can really benefit from having a little bit more information about the fundamentals of why relationship building is important. So I'd like to spend the next section of this episode just talking a little bit about concrete steps that you can take in your school to nurture those relationships. So nurturing relationships is a fundamental part of fundraising, and some of the elements of this have not changed in the COVID-19 crisis. There is a lot that's really familiar around how fundraisers nurture relationships. So the first thing that's familiar is that relationships take time to nurture. We need to get to know, like, and trust the organisations and the people that we're considering supporting with our philanthropic donations. The larger the donation, the more important that is, and also often the longer it takes to develop that relationship. So what's really important is that consistency is part of that relationship. This isn't a sporadic communication between your school and your potential donors. It's a consistent flow of information. And it's a two-way flow of information. This isn't just pushing out annual reports and social media posts and so on, assuming that people are going to read that and feel more positive towards the school. It's about engaging in conversations and really understanding what it is that people want to give to and what makes them tick. And this is why we see in the benchmarking that IDPE has done over the number of years that fundraising income takes time to build over the years. So the IDPE benchmarking has shown that there's actually a clear jump in fundraising income after 7 years of having a development office. Now, that's not to say you have to wait that long to show a positive flow of income, but there's a sudden jump of average income from 250,000 to 850,000 at around the 7-year mark. And one of the factors that underpins that is the fact that it takes time to develop these relationships and to get to know who are the people in your community who have the capacity to make these significant donations, what kind of projects they want to give to, and taking the time to build those relationships. So none of that has changed. This consistency is still really important when we're fundraising, both during and after the current COVID-19 crisis. So it's really important that we don't stop relationship building. Now, as fundraisers, we often use what's called a donor pipeline to think about the way that individuals that we're working with move through that process of knowing, liking, and trusting both the school and the senior leadership within it. And we often think of fundraising as being the ask. In actual fact, the ask is only one stage on the donor pipeline. So the identification of donors, the cultivation of them, which means developing relationships with them, that all precedes the ask, and all of that can still happen. So the cultivation of these relationships not only can continue during COVID-19, but really has to continue during COVID-19. You can't just press a pause button on a personal relationship and expect to pick up again where you left off. And then after somebody's made a gift, that stewardship stage on the donor pipeline is really important. And making sure you're looking after your former donors is a key part of what you need to be doing at the moment. The idea of the donor pipeline is still entirely relevant within the COVID-19 era. So thinking about how you're developing relationships through the cultivation before the ask and the stewardship after the ask is really important at the moment. But obviously some things have changed during this crisis, and we have seen many schools step back from specifically the ask stage of the major gifts fundraising at the moment. And that's not surprising. You do need to take extra caution around asking at the moment, but that's not the same as saying that you can't ask. In every individual ask you make with a major donor, you're always thinking about when is the right time, what's the right project, what's the right level of gift to be asking for. All of that reflection and consideration continues as before. It's just that in many cases, it may be right to just pause and hold back a little bit for the moment. But any pause in developing the relationships with those donors is going to delay or even potentially prevent future asks down the line. So the conversations you're having now with potential donors are going to be the foundation of fundraising asks that you're making in 12 months' time. You need to have a strategy, a plan in place for how you're going to continue to manage those relationships and develop them through this crisis. So throughout the crisis, all of our communications, all of our relationships, everything needs to show empathy, and we need to be reflecting on the crisis authentically with people and sharing how the school is coming through this crisis, but also listening intently and actively to the experiences of our alumni, of our potential donors, and of our parents. And that two-way communication is absolutely critical at the moment. So I'd like to share with you some steps that you can take, concrete steps that you can take over the next couple of months in order to protect your fundraising income, using this idea of maintaining consistent relationships. Now, the people who are listening to this podcast will all be in different circumstances. So what I'd like to do is set out 2 steps that I really recommend every single school with any kind of fundraising ambition or activity takes the time to undertake. And then I'm going to set out 3 steps which, if you have the resources, are highly recommended. Okay, so the baseline, the 2 things I think you really should be doing. So step number 1, you need to be having personal conversations with at least your top 20 prospects or past donors. So prospects are the people whom you feel might be giving you a gift in the future, and your previous donors are the ones who have given you something in the past and who may or may not have the capacity to give to you again. Now, I've recommended 20. It may be that you have time to do more, or it may be that you have a smaller number. Whatever it is, identify a target number of prospects or past donors to keep in touch with, and then get in touch with them. It needs to be somebody on the senior leadership team. It doesn't necessarily have to be a director of development if you don't have one in post at the moment. It doesn't necessarily have to be the head, although that's highly recommended if possible. But someone on the senior leadership team needs to make contact with them roughly every 6 to 8 weeks. This isn't just a one-off conversation. This is a continued conversation over time. And for people who haven't made these sorts of calls before, there are some talking points. So clearly you don't want a script. It needs to be a natural, authentic conversation. But there are some talking points that you can use to structure those conversations. So first off, you need to be really asking authentically, how are you? And listen to their answer. Ask them how the shutdown has affected them, how they're experiencing things, get a sense of their mood, and get a sense of what their situation is like in terms of how it's been at home for them. Number 2, you need to genuinely offer to help. How can we help you? And I know some schools have even been delivering groceries to local elderly alumni in order to make sure that they have that support network. But more commonly, what a lot of schools have been doing is calling alumni who are feeling lonely and isolated. So things like that, how can we actually help you? Thirdly, you need to be informing them in a positive and upbeat way how your school is responding to the crisis. So sharing with them stories about how you're helping your local community, sharing with them the ways that your pupils have responded to the crisis and how they've really picked up the baton of learning at home, and any stories that you can tell around that would be helpful. And then fourthly, you want to update them on any projects that they've either supported in the past or that they've shown an interest in the past. Now, a lot of schools are fundraising for hardship funds or emergency funds where they're helping current parents with tuition. A lot of schools are stepping up on their bursary fundraising in terms of transformational bursaries for disadvantaged children. Whatever it is that your priorities are, just talk in a general sense around those. You're not building up to an ask in this conversation, but you're just informing them about the sorts of priorities that you have as a school. And at all times, obviously, you want to be empathetic to what it is they're experiencing, really authentic to yourself and your school's values, and positive and upbeat about the future and what it holds for your school. So that's step number 1, contacting your top 20 prospects or past donors. Step number 2 that I think every school should be doing, any school who has any kind of fundraising activity, is thanking your current regular donors. Now, one of the things that research has shown is that people don't tend to cut their regular donations just because of uncertainty around their income, but they do cut their regular donations for causes where they don't feel confident that their donations are having a really positive impact anymore. So they lose faith in the impact that their donations are having. So in order to avoid that, it's really important to contact all of your current regular donors. That might be by email, it might be by letter. And the message here is that you're repeating the positive impact they're having in continuing to make a donation. So you're really just thanking them for their continued support. Now, some people might be cancelling their donations at the moment. And if that happens, being really positive and saying, we completely understand. Thank you for your support in the past. We really appreciate it, and it's had a really significant impact. Concluding a regular donor relationship in a really positive way makes it much more likely that people will come back on board with donations when their financial situation allows philanthropic giving again. Okay, so those are the 2 tips for every school. Next, I'm going to give you 3 things which I think, if you have the resources, I would highly recommend that you consider at the moment to protect your future fundraising income. So number 1, when you make those calls to major prospects or major donors, be on the lookout for their giving signals. So this is the information which is going to inform the future asks that you might be making to those particular people. So you want to be getting a little bit of a sense around their inclination to give, as we call it in the fundraising world. So this is their connection to the school, their willingness generally to be charitable, and the types of projects that they have most interest in. And secondly, you get a sense of their ability to give. So this is around their wealth, their income, their capacity to make a significant donation. And all you're doing is just gathering little bits of information in your conversations and recording them, obviously following all data protection regulations wherever you are in the world, but recording them somewhere, and ideally in your development office database. Now, clearly when you've got development office staff either furloughed or whatever the situation is in your particular country, that can be a challenge, but whatever you do, you need to capture that information so that it can be put onto your database when the time is appropriate. So that's step number 1. When you have those conversations with your top 20 prospects, be on the lookout for giving signals. So step number 2, you want to be maintaining positive and 2-way social media communications. Now, a lot of schools use multiple social media platforms, so Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc., etc. And when you're fully staffed in your development office and your marketing team, that's great because it means you're reaching more people. If you've had to cut back on staffing within those teams, then you may want to consider reducing the number of platforms that you're active on and putting notices on the ones that you're currently just taking a pause from in order to focus on the 1 or 2 platforms where you get really good response from people. And what you're looking is for a 2-way communication. It's not just about pushing information out, it's about getting feedback on how people are feeling. And the reason for this, obviously, it's to maintain those relationships through this crisis. But there's a second reason as well. And that is, as we move through this crisis, we're going to get to the point where we start asking ourselves, okay, we're starting to come out of lockdown, or we're moving into the next phase. Are we ready yet to start doing X, Y, Z? Now, you're only going to be able to answer those questions if you've had feedback from your community. So you need to be having this 2-way communication stream. So you're getting information in about the sorts of things that people are worried about, the sorts of things people are enthusiastic about, the types of messages that are really hitting home and that people are really responding to, the types of messages that perhaps are riling people you might want to discontinue. So that 2-way social media communication is going to give you really important data, especially for that regular giving element going forwards. So that's step number 2, a positive 2-way social media communication. So step number 3, if you have the staffing, it's a really good idea to be thinking about virtual alumni events. Now, Often alumni event programs have been very heavy on in-person events. And actually, I think it's quite overdue that we're moving to a more virtual program of events. And obviously that's been forced upon us by the current situation. But there are so many opportunities for engaging alumni who aren't able to return to your school, who are scattered across the globe. With virtual events, all of this is possible. So things like webinars with an alumni speaker, networking around a particular theme or for a particular type of career on Zoom, pub quizzes. We've seen some brilliant pub quizzes bring some fun back into alumni relations programs, which is fantastic. So if you have the staffing, putting it into some of these virtual alumni events can really pay off in terms of developing and moving those relationships forward with alumni. And actually, it's a really big silver lining, I think, that we can do these things virtually and engage alumni across the planet now. Okay, so let's just sum up what we've been talking about in this episode. We looked first of all at the data from the 2008 financial crisis and the lessons that we can learn as fundraisers within schools. And we then looked at the importance of relationships in fundraising. So we looked at two things that every school, I think, should be doing to protect their fundraising income. So having conversations with your top 20 prospects and thanking all regular donors. And we also looked at three things which, if you have the staffing and resources, would be really, really useful. So looking out for giving signals and recording that information, maintaining a positive two-way social media communication stream, and running virtual alumni events. So if we're going to try to have the staffing and the resources to do those final three stages, we need to think a little bit about the investment in fundraising. Now, I know that many bursars and heads have been making really tough decisions around cash flow for your schools. It's been an incredibly challenging time, and many schools have been having to cut back on development office staff and put them on furlough for the moment. And I really understand that cash flow is a significant challenge right now. But what I just appeal to you to think about is that investing in fundraising is an investment in an income stream. It's not just a cost on your bottom line. And without investment in those relationships and building those relationships through this crisis, you're actually going to damage your potential fundraising income going forwards. So it's really important that you continue to review those furloughing decisions and think about, when the time is right, bringing back those development staff that you might have had to put on furlough to help maintain these relationships, build these relationships. All of this will mean that you will be able to ask sooner. But if you want your fundraising income to be a pillar of your post-crisis business model, it's investing in that relationship building, which is absolutely critical. And just to complete the circle and go back to that data we were looking at the beginning, this isn't just me saying that you need to invest in the development office in order to protect your future fundraising income. This is borne out by the data from previous recessions, looking at the fact that yes, donations will fall, but they will come back again. This is reflecting the research into why people give, and understanding that developing relationships takes time, and people have to feel that connection to a cause in order to make a significant donation. It's also borne out by the benchmarking. So looking in the UK at the schools benchmarking data for IDPE, we see that continued investment over time is one of the really key elements that drives fundraising income. So I hope that's been some really useful data, research findings, and some concrete steps to take to protect your fundraising income going forwards. We're going to be looking a little bit more detail in a future episode about your case for support and how you need to evolve and reimagine that case for support for the COVID-19 era. But for the moment, I'm going to sign off and say thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye. So that's it for now, and thanks for listening. Don't forget that you can subscribe to the Independent School Podcast to hear our next episode, or sign up for my regular newsletter at www.consultjuliet.co.uk/sign up. Great, see you next time.